Dawn broke over the Carmel mountains, casting long shadows across Clint Eastwood's remote cabin. Inside his study, sunlight illuminated an intricate arrangement of objects: a faded photograph, film negatives, an antique compass, and a worn script page bearing a single name crossed out in red. For months, the 94-year-old filmmaker had been working on what he called his final project, speaking cryptically about setting the record straight while there's still time. 3 days ago, Eastwood vanished, leaving behind this carefully orchestrated tableau. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just a puzzle of memories meticulously staged by a master storyteller with one last tale to tell. What did these artifacts mean? And why had Hollywood's most enduring icon disappeared just as he was about to reveal a secret he'd kept for over 6 decades? What dark chapter of cinema history was Clint Eastwood trying to resurrect from the shadows? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Megan Reeves stood on the wooden porch of Clint Eastwood's mountain retreat, her knuckles white as she gripped her phone. The cool California morning air filled her lungs, but did nothing to calm her racing heart. She'd called Eastwood's private line 17 times since yesterday afternoon. 17 calls, 17 iterations of his gravelly voicemail greeting, 17 moments of escalating worry. "Come on, Clint," she whispered to the surrounding pines, their shadows stretching across the gravel driveway where her Prius sat alongside Eastwood's weathered Jeep Cherokee. "Where are you?" At 43, Megan had spent 15 years as Eastwood's personal assistant, a position that had evolved from professional to familial. She knew his habits, his preferences, his routines. 3 days ago, he'd driven up to this secluded cabin, as he often did when starting a new project, planning to return yesterday afternoon for a meeting with potential financiers for his documentary. Clint never missed meetings. In 15 years, he'd never been unreachable for more than a few hours. She turned the spare key in the lock and pushed open the heavy wooden door, calling his name. The cabin's interior was cool and still. Morning light, streaming through east-facing windows. Coffee grounds still sat in the filter of the machine, unused. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen. Everything was immaculate, orderly, just as Clint preferred it. "Mr. Eastwood?" Her voice echoed off pine walls adorned with black and white photographs, moments captured from 6 decades in film. Megan moved through the main room to the bedroom where the bed was made with military precision. No sign of disturbance, no hint of illness or accident. It was only when she reached his study that she stopped short. Unlike the rest of the cabin, this room felt intentional in its disarray. Papers were spread across the antique desk, weighted down by curious objects. A vintage compass gleamed in the morning light beside a stack of yellowed photographs. Film negatives were carefully arranged beside a magnifying glass, and centered on the blotter was an open leather journal, a page marked with a red silk ribbon. Megan approached slowly, as if the desk were a crime scene she feared contaminating. Her eyes fell to the journal entry, dated 3 days earlier. October 17, 2024. The past doesn't stay buried. Not when the truth matters this much. I've traced the last reel to the Marston property. After 60 years, I can finally make this right. Wilson deserves to have his name cleared. They all do. Below the entry was a detailed sketch, what appeared to be a map with landmarks noted in Eastwood's distinctive handwriting, and beside it, a black and white photograph of 5 men standing before a movie camera. One face was circled. In faded red ink, Megan sank into Clint's leather chair, the enormity of the situation settling over her. This wasn't a simple disappearance. This was something Clint had planned, something connected to the documentary project he'd been so secretive about in recent months. She reached for her phone, scrolling past the emergency contacts to one she rarely used. Dr. Eleanor Washington. the film preservation specialist Clint had consulted several times in the past year. "Eleanor, it's Megan Reeves, Clint Eastwood's assistant. I think you should come to his cabin. There's something you need to see." Sheriff Ray Tanner had seen a lot in his 30 years with the Monterey County Sheriff's Department, but he'd never expected to be standing in Clint Eastwood's study, examining what looked like an elaborate treasure map. At 63, Tanner was just 3 months from retirement, his weathered face telling the story of decades under the California sun. He removed his hat, revealing a silver crew cut, and rubbed his temple. "So, you're telling me Mr. Eastwood hasn't been seen for 3 days, his car's still here, but you don't believe it's foul play?" He directed the question to Megan, who stood with arms crossed near the window. "I know how it sounds, Sheriff, but Clint is methodical. This," she gestured to the arranged items on the desk, "isn't random. He left these things this way for a reason." Eleanor Washington adjusted her glasses, carefully examining the negatives without touching them. At 56, the film preservation expert had dedicated her career to saving cinema history from decay and obscurity. Her grandmother's blacklisted screenplays had inspired a lifelong mission to preserve forgotten voices. "These are 35 mm negatives from the early 60s, Eleanor said, leaning close. "Possibly from an unfinished production. See the slate in this frame? Sundown Trail. I don't recognize the title." Sheriff Tanner sighed, jotting notes in a small pad. "Regardless of how intentional this looks, we have a 94-year-old man missing in rugged terrain. His car's here, which means he either left on foot or with someone else. Or he didn't leave at all." A new voice added from the doorway. The 3 turned to see a young woman with an Academy Film Archive badge clipped to her jacket. Sophie Chen, Eleanor's digital archiving specialist, entered with a tablet in hand. At 29, she represented the cutting edge of film preservation technology, the bridge between Eleanor's traditional methods and the digital future. "Dr. Washington asked me to come," Sophie explained, nodding to the sheriff. "And I think I've found something interesting about this property." She turned her tablet around, displaying a topographical map. "There's an old fire road that doesn't appear on modern maps, leading from behind this cabin to what used to be the Marston Ranch. The property mentioned in Mr. Eastwood's journal." Megan's eyes widened. "He's been researching the Marston family for months. Something about a film shoot that happened there in the early 60s. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she carefully turned a page in Eastwood's journal. "Listen to this entry from last month. Found Wilson's name in the production. Notes deliberately omitted from the credits. The studio buried more than just the film after the hearings. They buried careers, lives, reputations, all because McCarthy needed scapegoats." "McCarthy?" Sheriff Tanner asked. "As in Joseph McCarthy? The communist witch hunts?" "The Hollywood blacklist," Eleanor confirmed, her voice solemn. "From the late 40s through the 50s, hundreds of film industry professionals were denied work because of alleged communist ties. Some were actually Communist Party members, many weren't. But careers were destroyed either way." Sophie moved to the desk, examining the arrangement. "It's like a puzzle, each piece positioned to tell us something." Megan picked up a framed photograph. She hadn't noticed before. A much younger Clint Eastwood on the set of Rawhide, the TV Western that launched his career, standing beside an older man with a script in hand. Sheriff Tanner's radio crackled and he stepped outside to respond, leaving the 3 women studying the mysterious tableau. "I think Clint is trying to tell us something about Hollywood history," Eleanor said quietly. "Something he feels responsible for correcting." "But why disappear?" Megan asked, worry etching lines around her eyes. "Why not just tell us what he's working on?" Sophie carefully examined the map sketch. "Maybe because some stories can't just be told. They have to be discovered." By early afternoon, the cabin had become a hub of activity. Sheriff Tanner had called in deputies to organize a search of the surrounding area, while Megan fielded increasingly concerned calls from Eastwood's family and business associates. In the study, Eleanor and Sophie continued their careful examination of the items Eastwood had left behind. "I think I've identified one of the men in this photograph," Eleanor said, pointing to the circled face. "Richard Wilson. He was a promising director in the 50s, worked with Orson Welles, then suddenly disappeared from the industry around 1962. The same Wilson mentioned in Clint's journal?" Megan asked, bringing in a tray of coffee for the increasingly crowded room. "I believe so," Eleanor nodded, accepting a mug gratefully. "According to what I can find, Wilson was developing a Western called Sundown Trail, with United Artists. Production started, then abruptly halted. The film was never completed." Sophie looked up from her tablet. "I've been digging through digital archives of the trade papers from that era. There's almost nothing about Sundown Trail, but I did find this small item." She enlarged a scanned newspaper clipping. "Production suspended on UA Western. Sources cite creative differences, as Western drama Sundown Trail ceases filming at Marston Ranch location. Director R. Wilson unavailable for comment." "Creative differences," Eleanor scoffed. "Classic studio code for someone got blacklisted." The front door opened, and Sheriff Tanner returned with a slender, elderly man in work clothes, his weathered hands marked by decades of outdoor labor. "This is Victor Ramirez," the sheriff introduced. "He's worked as Mr. Eastwood's groundskeeper for over 20 years. Thought he might have some insights." Victor, 75 and straight-backed despite his age, nodded respectfully to the room. "Miss Reeves," he acknowledged Megan before turning his attention to the desk full of artifacts. "Did you see Clint before he disappeared, Victor?" Megan asked. "3 days ago," Victor confirmed in a soft, accented voice. "He asked me about the old trails behind the property, specifically if any led to the Marston place. I told him yes, there's an overgrown fire road that connects the properties. It was used during the filming of a movie there in the 60s. Eleanor straightened. "You remember a film shooting at the Marston Ranch?" "I was young, maybe 12, Victor said, eyes distant with memory. "My father worked as a ranch hand there. I remember men with cameras, lights. They built part of a western town set. The filming stopped suddenly. The director, a kind man who always greeted us workers, he disappeared. The crew packed up within days." Sophie looked up from her research. "Mr. Ramirez, do you remember the director's name?" "Richard," Victor said without hesitation. "Richard Wilson. He gave me a small part as an extra. 1 line. I was supposed to be in a real Hollywood movie." He smiled sadly. But the film was never finished. The room fell silent as the connection solidified. Clint Eastwood, rawhide actor turned legendary filmmaker, had somehow become entangled with the unfinished project of a blacklisted director from 60 years ago. "Victor," Megan asked carefully, "did Clint say anything else before he left? Anything about where he might be going?" The groundskeeper approached the desk, examining the map with careful eyes. "He asked if I knew about any structures still standing at the old Marston place. I told him the main house burned down years ago, but the old barn and what they called the projection shed were still there last I knew." "Projection shed," Eleanor prompted. "A small building where they would review the day's filming," Victor's explained. "They had equipment there. Screens." Sheriff Tanner cleared his throat. "The Marston property is abandoned now. Has been for decades. It's about 4 miles through rough country from here. If Mr. Eastwood went there on foot, then—" "We need to go there immediately," Megan said, her voice firm with resolve. "Clint's in excellent shape for his age, but he's still 94 years old." "I've got deputies searching the trail now," Tanner assured her. "But there's something else we need to consider." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "If Mr. Eastwood went to that property deliberately, without telling anyone, he might not appreciate us following him." "With all due respect, Sheriff," Megan countered, "I don't care if he appreciates it or not. If there's a chance he's out there, possibly injured or worse, I'm going to find him." Eleanor gathered the journal and several photographs. "I'm coming, too." Whatever Clint discovered about Sundown Trail and Richard Wilson, it clearly matters enough for him to go to extraordinary lengths. As a film preservationist, I need to understand why. "I should stay here," Sophie suggested, "in case he returns, or tries to make contact. Plus, I can continue researching digitally." Sheriff Tanner nodded, resigned to the inevitable. "We'll assemble a small search party. Mr. Ramirez, if you're willing to guide us along the old fire road." Victor nodded, solemnly, "For Mr. Eastwood, of course." As they prepared to depart, Megan paused at the desk, studying the intentional arrangement of artifacts one last time. Whatever message Clint was trying to send through this tableau, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was about much more than a forgotten film. It was about setting something right before it was too late. She picked up the compass, an antique brass piece with a worn leather case, and slipped it into her pocket. Something told her they would need guidance beyond mere directions to solve the mystery Clint Eastwood had left behind. The old fire road had long since surrendered to nature's reclamation. What once served as an access route for film crews and ranch hands was now little more than a suggestion, cutting through dense underbrush and towering pines. Sheriff Tanner led their small party. Himself, Megan, Eleanor, Victor, and 2 deputies along the overgrown path, the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy above. "Mr. Eastwood really came this way?" one of the younger deputies asked, swatting at a branch. "At his age," Victor nodded without breaking stride. "Mr. Eastwood walks these mountains regularly. Age hasn't diminished his determination." Megan smiled despite her worry. It was true. In the 15 years she'd worked for him, Clint had never allowed his advancing years to dictate his capabilities. Even in his 90s, he maintained a regimen that would exhaust men half his age. He rose early, ate sparingly, and walked daily. Habits formed during 6 decades in an industry that worshipped youth. "How much farther to the Marston property?" Eleanor asked, adjusting her backpack containing Eastwood's journal and the photographs they'd found. "Another mile or so," Victor replied. "We'll see the old barn first, then the projection shed I mentioned." Sheriff Tanner paused, consulting his GPS. "My deputies who went ahead haven't reported back yet, which means they haven't found any sign of Mr. Eastwood on the main trail." "Maybe because he wasn't taking the main trail," Megan suggested. "Clint is methodical. If he was following some kind of historical breadcrumb trail, he might have veered off the obvious path." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "Especially if he was using that map in his journal. It's from the 1960s. The landscape would have changed significantly since then." They continued in determined silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what might have driven a 94-year-old Hollywood legend to venture alone into the wilderness. The path gradually widened as they approached what had once been the entrance to the Marston Ranch, now marked only by a fallen wooden gate half buried in wild grasses. Victor stopped suddenly, pointing ahead. There, the barn. In the clearing stood a weather-beaten structure, its red paint long since faded to a rusty brown. Though leaning slightly, the barn had withstood decades of neglect, its solid timber frame a testament to craftsmanship from another era. Sheriff Tanner motioned for his deputy to approach first, hand resting cautiously on his sidearm. "Mr. Eastwood," he called out. "Monterey County Sheriff's Department. Anyone here?" Silence answered, broken only by the distant call of a hawk. The group approached the barn, its massive doors hanging partially open. Inside, shafts of sunlight penetrated through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The smell of aged wood and hay long since turned to dust filled their nostrils. "Looks like someone's been here recently," the deputy observed. Pointing to footprints in the dusty floor, Megan knelt to examine them. "These could be Clint's. He wears size 11 boots." She looked up at the sheriff. "These tracks are fresh." They followed the footprints to the back of the barn, where they disappeared near a ladder leading to a hayloft. Sheriff Tanner climbed. Up first, flashlight in hand, and the others heard his sharp intake of breath. "Found something," he called down. "You'll want to see this." One by one, they ascended the wooden ladder to the loft, where Sheriff Tanner stood before a makeshift workspace. A folding table held an array of items: maps, old photographs, and newspaper clippings secured with stones to prevent them from blowing away. A battery-powered lantern sat unlit at the center. "Clint set this up," Megan said with certainty, recognizing his organizational style. "This is how he prepares for his films, creating a visual storyboard of research." Eleanor approached the table reverently, examining the materials. "These are all about Sundown Trail and the Hollywood Blacklist." She picked up a studio memo dated 1962. "This is extraordinary. Internal correspondence about shutting down production after Wilson was named in HUAC testimony." "HUAC?" Sheriff Tanner questioned. "House Un-American Activities Committee," Eleanor's explained. "They investigated alleged communist infiltration in American society, including Hollywood. Many careers were destroyed based on mere accusations." "Look at this," Megan said, holding up a call sheet yellowed with age. "Clint's name is on here. He was cast in Sundown Trail in a supporting role." Eleanor's eyes widened. "That can't be right. There's no record of Eastwood being involved with this production." "Unless his involvement was scrubbed from the record when the film was shelved," Megan suggested. Victor moved to another corner of the loft where several wooden crates were stacked against the wall. "These weren't here last time I visited this property," he said, examining the faded markings. "United Artists, 1962. Sheriff Tanner helped him pry open the top crate, revealing nested layers of film canisters, each carefully labeled. Eleanor gasped, approaching with reverent hands. "Original 35mm film from Sundown Trail," she whispered. This is incredible. Most unfinished films from this era were destroyed or lost. But how did they end up here? And how did Clint know about them?" Megan wondered aloud. The answer came in the form of another document on the table. A letter dated 1962, written on United Artists letterhead, "Mr. Wilson. In light of your recent testimony, the studio has no choice but to cease production on Sundown Trail. As discussed, all existing footage will be stored at the Marston location until further notice. Your contract is hereby terminated. Under no circumstances are you to discuss the political content of the screenplay with the press or other industry members. The studio disavows any knowledge of your communist sympathies and the potentially inflammatory content of the unproduced scenes. Arthur Krim, United Artists." Eleanor read the letter twice, her hands trembling. This is it. Sundown Trail wasn't just another Western. It was making some kind of political statement, something that became dangerous once Wilson was blacklisted. And the studio buried the evidence here, Megan concluded. But why would Clint care so much about this specific lost film? He must have worked on dozens of projects that never saw completion. "Perhaps this will explain," Victor said quietly, retrieving a small leather-bound book from beneath the maps. "Not Eastwood's journal, but something much older. I found this tucked behind the crates." Eleanor opened it carefully, recognizing it immediately as a director's shooting diary. The inscription on the first page read, "Richard Wilson, Sundown Trail, 1962. "Wilson's production diary," she breathed. "This is beyond valuable for film history." She turned the pages delicately, scanning entries that detailed the daily progress of shooting, casting notes, and technical challenges. Then she stopped abruptly, reading aloud. March 14th, 1962. Young. "Eastwood continues to impress. Raw talent, but instinctively understands the camera. Confided in me today about his concerns with the McCarthy hearings. Unlike most promising actors, he's willing to work with questionable talents like myself. Rare courage in these paranoid times." March 21st, 1962. Production halted temporarily. Studio executives concerned about thematic elements. The Western genre has always been about American mythology, yet they balk at examining the darker side of that myth. The parallels between frontier justice and current political witch hunts are apparently too transparent. April 2nd, 1962. Disaster. My name appeared in this morning's testimony. Studio pulling the plug. Eastwood offered to advocate for me with the producers, but I won't let him risk his future. The boy has too much potential to be tainted by association with me. April 5th, 1962. Final decision. All footage to be secured in the projection shed. I've convinced the studio exec to preserve, rather than destroy the reels. Perhaps someday, when this madness has passed, Sundown Trail might see completion. Eastwood promised to remember where we left things. A good young man in an industry short on integrity. The group stood in stunned silence as the connections formed. Clint Eastwood, early in his career, had worked with a director subsequently blacklisted. The film they were making together, apparently containing commentary on McCarthyism veiled within Western tropes, had been shut down. And now, 62 years later, Eastwood had returned to recover the lost footage. He's trying to fulfill a promise, Megan said softly. A promise he made when he was just starting out, to a man who lost everything. The projection shed, Sheriff Tanner remembered. Victor, you said it's still standing. Victor nodded. Beyond the main house ruins, closer to the creek, about a quarter-mile from here. That's where we'll find him, Eleanor said with certainty. If Clint came here for the film reels, that's where he would go. As they descended from the loft, the radio on Sheriff Tanner's belt crackled to life. Sheriff, this is Martinez. We've reached the main house ruins. No sign of Mr. Eastwood, but there's fresh vehicle tracks approaching from the county road. Someone else has been here recently. Tanner frowned, responding, Copy that. Meet us at the projection shed. And Martinez, approach, with caution. We may not be the only ones looking for Mr. Eastwood. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to soften toward evening, casting long shadows across the overgrown property. Megan felt a growing sense of urgency as they followed Victor along a barely discernible path toward the creek. Who else would know about this place? She asked Sheriff Tanner. About the films? That's what concerns me, he replied. If these films contain what Dr. Washington suggests, political commentary that got buried during the blacklist era, there might be people who still prefer they stay buried. After 60 years? Eleanor questioned. The studios are under different management now. Most of the executives from that era are long gone. Legacies matter, Megan said quietly, especially in Hollywood. If these films reveal studio complicity in destroying careers over politics, they fell silent as they crested a small rise and saw the projection shed below. A small, bunker-like structure built partially into the hillside. Unlike the barn, this building had been constructed of concrete and corrugated metal, designed to protect valuable film equipment from the elements, and parked beside it was a black SUV with tinted windows. Sheriff Tanner immediately signaled for everyone to stop and take cover behind a cluster of boulders. Martinez, he spoke quietly into his radio, we have an unknown vehicle at the projection shed. Approach from the west. Side, out of sight. What do we do? Megan whispered, her heart racing. Clint could be in there. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before the sheriff could answer, the metal door of the projection shed swung open. A tall, thin man in his 70s emerged, carrying what appeared to be a film canister. He placed it carefully in the SUV's trunk, then returned to the shed. I know him, Eleanor gasped. That's Marcus Goldstein. He's a former studio executive, now runs a film history foundation. What is he doing here? Nothing good, judging by the secretive nature of his actions, Sheriff Tanner observed. Dr. Washington, does Mr. Goldstein have any connection to United Artists or Sundown Trail? Eleanor's brow furrowed in concentration. He would have been very young during the Blacklist era, probably just starting in the industry. But his uncle was Benjamin Goldstein, a major producer at United Artists during that period. Family connections, Megan murmured. Protecting the family legacy. The shed door opened again, and this time 2 figures emerged. Marcus Goldstein was supporting a much older man, who moved slowly but with unmistakable dignity. Clint. Megan started to rise, but Sheriff Tanner held her back. "Wait," he cautioned. "Something's not right." They watched as Goldstein helped Eastwood into the passenger seat of the SUV, then returned to the shed once more. When he emerged again, he was carrying several more film canisters, which he carefully arranged in the vehicle's trunk. "He's taking the films," Eleanor realized. "But why? And is Clint helping him, or—" "Only one way to find out," Sheriff Tanner decided, raising his radio. "Martinez, on my signal, we're going to approach the vehicle. Non-threatening, but I want a clear view of all parties. Ready?" "Ready, Sheriff. Now." They rose from their concealment and descended toward the projection shed, maintaining a casual but purposeful pace. Sheriff Tanner led, hands visible and away from his weapon, with Megan and Eleanor following close behind. Victor and the second deputy remained in reserve, watching from the ridgeline. Marcus Goldstein spotted them immediately, freezing beside the SUV's open trunk. His expression shifted from surprise to resignation as Sheriff Tanner approached. "Afternoon," Tanner called. "Monterey County Sheriff. Mind if we have a word?" Goldstein's shoulders slumped slightly. "I suppose I should have expected company." He gestured toward the passenger seat. "He's inside, exhausted, but unharmed." Megan rushed to the SUV, throwing open the door to find Clint Eastwood sitting calmly, his weathered hands resting on a film canister in his lap. Though visibly tired, his eyes were clear and alert. "Megan," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Took you long enough." "Clint," relief flooded her voice. "Are you all right? We've been worried sick." "I'm fine," he assured her, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly timbre, perhaps a bit weaker than usual. "Just finishing some long-overdue business." He glanced at Goldstein, who was now speaking with Sheriff Tanner. "With an old acquaintance." Eleanor approached, unable to contain her professional curiosity despite the tense situation. "Mr. Eastwood, these films, they're from Sundown Trail, aren't they? Richard Wilson's unfinished project?" A ghost of a smile touched Eastwood's lips. "Dr. Washington, should have known you'd piece it together." He patted the canister in his lap. "Not just unfinished, deliberately buried, along with the reputations of some good people." Sheriff Tanner joined them, his expression a mixture of relief and confusion. "Mr. Eastwood, Mr. Goldstein has been explaining the situation, but I'd appreciate hearing your version. You've been missing for 3 days. Not missing, Sheriff," Eastwood corrected mildly, "just occupied with important work." He gestured to the projection shed. "We've been reviewing 60-year-old footage that tells a very different story than the official Hollywood narrative about the Blacklist era." Megan looked between Eastwood and Goldstein, struggling to understand. "So you two are working together?" Marcus Goldstein stepped forward, his tall frame slightly stooped with age. "Not initially. I came here to prevent Mr. Eastwood from uncovering films that could potentially damage my family's reputation. My Uncle Benjamin was involved in enforcing the blacklist at United Artists. But when I arrived," Goldstein continued, "I found Mr. Eastwood had already located the cache of films and set up projection equipment. He convinced me to watch them with him. 3 days of watching lost cinema," Eastwood added, a spark of the old intensity lighting his eyes, "and confronting some uncomfortable truths about Hollywood history." Eleanor could barely contain herself. You actually viewed the film? Is it complete? What's the content that was considered so dangerous? Not here, Eastwood said firmly, glancing at the fading light. These films need proper preservation, and there's someone else who needs to see them first, someone who's waited even longer than I have for justice. Catherine Montgomery, Goldstein. Supplied. She was a supporting actress in Sundown Trail, blacklisted by association when Wilson was named. She's 97 now, living in a retirement community in Monterey. Kit, Eastwood nodded. One of the finest actresses of her generation, reduced to bit parts and eventually forced out of the industry. She deserves to see this film before anyone else. Sheriff Tanner removed his hat, running a hand through his silver crew cut. So, there was no emergency? No foul play? No crime beyond those committed in the name of patriotism 60 years ago, Eastwood confirmed. He turned to Megan. I'm sorry for the worry, but this needed to be handled quietly. Some wounds don't heal properly in the spotlight. As the group began preparing to return to civilization, Eleanor helped carefully transfer the remaining film, canisters to Sheriff Tanner's vehicle, treating each one as the historical treasure it was. Megan assisted Clint from the SUV, noting with concern how the 3-day mission had taxed his strength despite his protests to the contrary. Clint, she asked quietly as they walked slowly toward the vehicles. Why now? After all these years? Eastwood paused, looking back at the projection shed, a concrete bunker that had protected not just film, but truth for over 6 decades. Richard Wilson died believing his best work would never see the light of day, he said, his voice carrying the weight of long-held obligation. Before he passed, he made me promise that if times ever changed enough, I'd find a way to tell his a story. He gestured to the film canisters being carefully loaded. Not my story, Megan. Theirs. The ones who lost everything because they dared to question American myths during a time of fear. As the sun began to set over the Carmel Mountains, the unlikely group prepared to depart the Marston property. A moment of historical resurrection was at hand, one that would challenge Hollywood's sanitized narrative of its darkest chapter and perhaps provide long-overdue vindication for those whose names had been struck from cinema history. The caravan of vehicles wound its way back through the mountains as darkness fell. In Sheriff Tanner's SUV, Clint Eastwood sat in contemplative silence, occasionally glancing at the film canister he refused to relinquish. Megan watched him from the adjacent seat, relieved at his safety but troubled by the toll the 3-day vigil had clearly taken. Despite his legendary resilience, 94 years weighed visibly on his frame tonight. You should have told me what you were planning, she said softly, breaking the silence. I could have helped. Eastwood turned from the window, the passing, shadows accentuating the deep lines of his face. Some journeys can't be delegated, Megan. I made a promise, man to man, filmmaker to filmmaker. Richard Wilson saved my career before it even began. The least I could do was preserve his. By disappearing into the mountains for 3 days, Sheriff Tanner interjected from the driver's seat, unable to keep the note of reproach from his voice. With respect, Mr. Eastwood, at your age that's a risky proposition. A familiar half-smile crossed Eastwood's face. Risk is relative, Sheriff. What's riskier? An old man spending a few days in a well-supplied cabin, or letting the truth stay buried until there's no one left alive who remembers it? In the vehicle behind them, Eleanor and Sophie rode with Marcus Goldstein, the trio surrounded by carefully packed film canisters. Eleanor couldn't stop examining the faded labels, each one a time capsule from cinema's most shameful era. I still don't understand your role in all this, Mr. Goldstein, Sophie said, breaking the tense silence. If your uncle was involved in enforcing the blacklist, then I should be trying to protect his legacy? Goldstein finished, his voice weary. That was my intention when I learned Eastwood was seeking the Sundown Trail reels. My Uncle Benjamin died believing he'd made necessary choices during a complicated time. I grew up hearing how he'd protected the studio from subversive elements. He gazed out the window at the darkening forest. 3 days ago, I came to these mountains to prevent Eastwood from rewriting that narrative. Instead, I watched actual footage that told a very different story than the one my family has maintained for decades. What exactly does the film show? Eleanor asked, professional curiosity overriding protocol. Goldstein looked at her, conflict evident in his expression. It's not my place to say, but I will tell you this: Sundown Trail wasn't just another Western. It was an allegory, using frontier justice as a mirror for McCarthy's America. The parallels are uncomfortably clear. And that's why it was. Shelved? Sophie pressed. That, and because Richard Wilson was named in testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Once he was branded, everything he touched became toxic. Goldstein's voice dropped, including the careers of those who had worked with him. 2 hours later, the group had reassembled at Eastwood's main residence in Carmel, a spacious yet understated home that reflected its owner's preference for simplicity over Hollywood ostentation. In the wood-paneled study, they gathered around a large table where the film canisters now sat alongside the artifacts from the cabin. Clint had insisted on showering and changing clothes before addressing the group, and now appeared refreshed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, moving more easily than he had at the Marston property. Whatever physical toll the 3-day vigil had taken, his recovery capacity remained remarkable. First, he began, his voice stronger in the familiar surroundings. I owe you all an apology for the concern I caused. That wasn't my intention. What exactly was your intention, Clint? Megan asked, the relief of his safe return now giving way to genuine curiosity about the mission that had driven him. Eastwood moved to a credenza and withdrew a leather portfolio, from which he extracted several documents. 6 months ago, I received this. He held up a letter written on faded stationery. It came from Richard Wilson's son, who was cleaning out his father's effects after his widow passed away. He passed the letter to Eleanor, who read aloud, Mr. Eastwood, you may not remember me, but we met briefly at my father's funeral in 1991. I was too young then to understand the history between you and Dad, but Mother made sure I knew the story, before she passed last month. Among her personal effects, I found the enclosed key and note from Dad, asking that it be delivered to you if anything significant about Sundown Trail ever resurfaced. A film history professor recently contacted me about including Dad in a documentary about blacklisted directors, which Mother always hoped would happen someday. Dad always spoke highly of your loyalty during a time when loyalty was in short supply in Hollywood. Sincerely, Thomas Wilson. Eleanor looked up from the letter. The key. Eastwood held up a small, tarnished key. To a safety deposit box in Monterey National Bank. Inside was this. He unfolded a hand-drawn map, the original of the one they'd found in his journal, along with a typewritten document. Richard's personal account of what really happened with Sundown Trail, Eastwood explained, and explicit directions to where the film reels were hidden at the Marston property. Sheriff Tanner leaned forward, professional interest piqued. So Wilson himself arranged for the films to be preserved rather than destroyed. He convinced the studio it might be valuable someday, Goldstein interjected. According to my uncle's records, they agreed to archive the footage rather than burn it, partly because burning film was hazardous, partly because executives always hedge their bets. But they buried it so deep in the records that no one would stumble across it accidentally. Until now, Sophie added. Eastwood nodded. Wilson knew the political climate would eventually change. He just didn't know if it would happen in his lifetime. A shadow crossed his face. It didn't. But why the elaborate setup? Megan asked. The arranged items in your study? Disappearing without telling anyone? That part wasn't planned, Eastwood admitted. I initially intended just a day trip to confirm the location, but when I found the films intact, he gestured to the canisters. I couldn't leave them there another night. And once I started reviewing the footage with the projection equipment, still in the shed, I lost track of time. Then I arrived, Goldstein continued, expecting confrontation, not collaboration. Instead, Mr. Eastwood invited me to watch the footage with him. 3 days of viewing history through a lens untainted by political paranoia. Eleanor could barely contain her professional excitement. And the films themselves, are they structurally intact, viewable? Remarkably well preserved, Eastwood confirmed. The concrete projection sheet protected them from temperature fluctuations, and Wilson had packed them professionally with desiccants. We need to transfer them to modern preservation media immediately, Eleanor insisted. Film this old is inherently unstable. Already arranged, Eastwood assured her. I've contacted Technicolor Restoration Services. They're sending a team tomorrow, with specialized equipment. He turned to Sophie. That's where your expertise will be invaluable, Ms. Chen. Digital preservation alongside physical restoration. Sophie straightened, clearly honored by the responsibility. Of course, I can oversee the digital transfer protocols. Sheriff Tanner cleared his throat. While this is all fascinating, I'm still unclear about the urgency and secrecy. These events happened over 60 years ago. Most of the people involved are no longer alive to face consequences, good or bad. Kit Montgomery is still alive, Eastwood said quietly, 97 years old, living at Cypress Gardens Retirement Community in Monterey. She's the last surviving cast member from Sundown Trail, and the one who paid the heaviest price for her association with Wilson. Catherine Montgomery. Eleanor's eyes widened in recognition. She was brilliant in a handful of films in the late 50s, then disappeared from cinema. I never knew she was blacklisted. Not officially, Goldstein clarified. Her name never appeared in testimony, but she was gray-listed. No formal accusation, just whispers and suddenly closed doors. Casting directors were told she was difficult or unprofessional. Classic industry code for political liability. All because she stood by Richard Wilson, Eastwood added, refused to denounce him when others did. By 1963, she couldn't get work anywhere in the industry. Last I heard, she taught drama at community colleges for decades. Megan studied Eastwood's face, seeing something rarely displayed, a vulnerability, perhaps even guilt. You knew her well? A complex emotion crossed his features. We were close during filming. When production shut down, I was still a nobody, a TV actor with a few lines on Rawhide. I couldn't help her then. His jaw tightened, but I can now. Morning light streamed through the windows of Eastwood's home as a flurry of activity transformed the space. Technicolor technicians had arrived, with specialized equipment for handling the delicate film reels. In the converted garage, they'd established a temporary preservation lab where Eleanor and Sophie worked alongside professionals to begin the careful process of transferring the aging 35mm film to modern media. In the kitchen, Megan prepared coffee, while Clint reviewed paperwork with Marcus Goldstein, legal documents ensuring the films would be properly credited and preserved through the Academy Film Archive. There's still the question of ownership, Goldstein pointed out. Technically, these films belong to whoever owns United Artists' pre-1967 catalog now. Already addressed, Eastwood replied, sliding over another document. I purchased the rights to Sundown Trail last month through a holding company. Cost next to nothing. The current rights holders had no idea what they had. To them, it was just an unfinished project on an accounting ledger. Goldstein scanned the document, impressed. You've thought of everything. Had 60 years to plan, Eastwood said simply. Sheriff Tanner entered from the study, having just ended a call. That was my office. I've explained the situation, so there won't be any missing persons case to deal with. He pocketed his phone. Though I'd appreciate a heads up next time you decide to go off-grid for a historical rescue mission, Mr. Eastwood. Eastwood's eyes crinkled with amusement. Don't plan on making a habit of it, Sheriff. What happens next? Megan asked, setting coffee mugs before them. With the films, I mean. First, Kit sees them, Eastwood said firmly. Then, proper documentation and preservation through the Academy. After that, he took a sip of coffee, considering. A limited screening, perhaps. These films tell an important story about a chapter of Hollywood history many would prefer to forget. My family included, Goldstein acknowledged soberly. But historical amnesia serves no one in the long run. The door from the garage opened and Eleanor entered, removing cotton preservation gloves. Her expression was difficult to read, somewhere between professional awe and personal emotion. You need to see this, she said simply. The group followed her into the garage-turned-laboratory, where Sophie stood beside a modern digital monitor displaying a black and white image, a freeze frame from the recently scanned footage. It showed a young woman in Western-era clothing, her expression fierce and dignified as she faced down a group of men. Catherine Montgomery, Eleanor indicated. This scene, it's extraordinary. Her character is defending a townsman accused of sympathizing with Native Americans against a vigilante committee determined to run him out of town. The allegory is hardly subtle, Sophie added. The dialogue directly parallels HUAC testimony terminology, words like loyalty, American values, dangerous influences. Eleanor pointed to another figure partially visible at the edge of the frame. And that's you, isn't it, Mr. Eastwood? Looking impossibly young. Indeed, a recognizable, if youthful, Clint Eastwood stood in the background, his familiar squint already evident despite being decades from fame. My character was supposed to undergo a transformation, Eastwood explained, beginning as part of the vigilante faction, eventually standing with Montgomery's character against the mob mentality. A hint of irony touched his voice. Life imitating art, in a way that never made it to screen. There's something else, Sophie said, advancing the footage several frames to another scene. Look at the slate before this take. The image showed a production slate with names clearly visible, but several had been crossed out with thick black marker, including R. Wilson, director, and 2 writers' names. Physical evidence of erasure, Eleanor whispered. They literally crossed out the problematic names from the record. Standard practice, Goldstein confirmed grimly. Studios would remove blacklisted individuals from all documentation. Credits, publicity materials, even internal memos would be revised. Sheriff Tanner studied the frozen image, his law enforcement instincts engaged. Destroying evidence. In any other context, we'd call that obstruction of justice. That's exactly what it was, Eastwood said quietly. Justice obstructed for an entire generation of artists. Megan had been watching Clint closely throughout, the revelation noting the unusual intensity in his gaze as he studied the monitor. There was something deeply personal in his connection to this footage, something beyond professional interest or even moral obligation. Clint, she asked carefully, what aren't you telling us about Sundown Trail? About Kit Montgomery? Eastwood's expression remained impassive, but a subtle tension appeared in his jaw, a tell Megan had learned to recognize over 15 years. He was weighing how much to reveal. Before he could respond, one of the technicians called from across the room. Dr. Washington, we found something unusual in canister 4. The moment broken, Eleanor moved to assist the technician, who had opened a film canister labeled Screen Tests, Not for Release. Inside, rather than a standard film reel, was a small leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope. This wasn't part of the film inventory, Eleanor noted, carefully removing the items with gloved hands. Eastwood approached, recognition dawning. That's Kit's handwriting, he said, indicating the name written on the envelope. For Clint, if these films are ever found. The room fell silent as Eastwood accepted the envelope, holding it for a long moment before carefully opening the seal. Inside was a single page, dated April 1962. Clint, if you're reading this, then Richard's hope that these films would someday be rediscovered was not in vain. I don't know how many years have passed since we stood together on that set, believing we were making something important. What happened to Richard was a tragedy. What happened to all of us who refused to denounce him was calculated cruelty. But what happened to you was my doing, and for that I can never forgive myself. When they pressured me to name others who shared Richard's sympathies, I protected you by insisting you were just a naive actor following direction, unaware of the film's subtext. In doing so, I severed our connection as surely as if I had denounced you. I chose your career over our future. Whether that choice was right, I'll never know, but I hope the young man I loved became the principled artist I believed he could be. Clint Eastwood folded the letter carefully, his expression unreadable as he placed it in his shirt pocket. The weight of 6 decades of silence hung in the air, a private history suddenly exposed. Megan and Eleanor exchanged glances, a new understanding dawning about Eastwood's determination to resurrect this particular lost film. This wasn't just about artistic integrity or historical justice. It was a deeply personal reckoning with his own past. "The car is ready whenever you are, Mr. Eastwood," one of his staff announced from the doorway. "Car?" Megan questioned. "To Cypress Gardens," Eastwood replied, his voice regaining its customary steadiness. "It's time Kit Montgomery saw her finest performance and received the recognition she deserved 60 years ago." As the group began preparations for the important meeting, Megan noticed Eastwood standing alone by the window, the morning light accentuating every line in his weathered face as he gazed at something in his palm. A small silver ring, simple in design, that had been concealed within the folds of Kit's letter. Cypress Gardens retirement community stood as an elegant anomaly among Monterey's modern developments, a sprawling Spanish colonial structure dating back to the 1930s, surrounded by gardens, that had given the facility its name. Original tile work and wrought iron details spoke of California's architectural heritage, while discreet modern additions provided the necessary accommodations for its elderly residents. Megan drove the range, Rover through the ornate entrance gates, glancing occasionally at Eastwood in the passenger seat. Since discovering Kit Montgomery's letter and the ring, he had retreated into a contemplative silence that even Megan, accustomed to his laconic nature, found unusual. Behind them followed a second vehicle carrying Eleanor, Sophie, and Marcus Goldstein, along with a carefully selected portion of the restored footage. "Have you seen her at all over the years?" Megan finally asked as they approached the circular driveway. Eastwood continued gazing out the window. "Once, in 1991, a retrospective screening of The Misfits at the Directors Guild. Kit was in the audience." The corner of his mouth twitched slightly. We nodded to each other across the room, never spoke. 60 years of silence, Megan marveled. And now, this. "Some conversations are worth waiting for," Eastwood replied, his attention fixed on the entrance as Megan parked. The retirement community's director met them in the lobby, a professionally pleasant woman in her 50s who clearly recognized Eastwood but maintained admirable composure. She had been informed only that they were bringing historically significant material specifically for Ms. Montgomery's viewing. "Ms. Montgomery has been informed you're coming, Mr. Eastwood, though I should mention she was somewhat skeptical about your visit," the director explained, leading them down a sunlit corridor decorated with enlarged black and white photographs of old Hollywood. "She's having a good day, cognitively, but please remember that at 97, fatigue can set in quickly. We'll be mindful of her energy," Eleanor assured her. "This is an important historical moment, but Ms. Montgomery's well-being is our primary concern." The director paused outside a door at the end of the corridor. "I should warn you, Catherine can be rather direct. Age has only sharpened her candor. A slight smile touched Eastwood's face. Some things never change. When the director opened the door, they entered a surprisingly spacious suite bathed in natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. Unlike many retirement apartments, this one bore little evidence of medical necessity. Instead, it was furnished with elegant antiques, walls lined with bookshelves and framed theater programs rather than medical certificates. In a wingback chair near the window sat Catherine "Kit" Montgomery, still striking despite her advanced years. White hair was arranged in a simple but elegant style, and though her frame had diminished with age, she maintained remarkably good posture. She wore a simple blue dress with a colorful scarf that added a touch of artistic flair. "Well," she said, her voice surprisingly strong, "Clint Eastwood finally remembers my address after 60 years. Should I be flattered or suspicious?" The familiar directness brought a genuine smile to Eastwood's face. "Hello, Kit. Catherine, these visitors have brought something they believe will interest you," the director began. Kit waved her hand dismissively. Yes, Beverly, you can leave us. I'm not so decrepit that I need supervision for a conversation." Her sharp blue eyes assessed the group. "Though I admit I'm curious about this entourage you've brought, Clint." As the director departed with a slightly apologetic glance, Eastwood performed introductions. Kit's gaze lingered on Eleanor and Sophie when their association with film preservation was mentioned. "Preservationists," she repeated, something knowing in her expression. "This isn't a social call, is it, Clint?" "Not entirely," he admitted, moving to sit in the chair opposite hers while the others found seats around the spacious room. "We found something, Kit. Something that's been missing for a very long time." For the first time, a flash of vulnerability crossed the elderly actress's face. "After all these years, you can't mean—" "Sundown Trail," Eastwood confirmed quietly. "The complete negatives, preserved in the projection shed at Marston Ranch, exactly where Richard hid them in '62. Kit's hand rose to her throat in a gesture of genuine shock. For a moment, the cultivated poise gave way to raw emotion. "You found Richard's film, all of it." Eleanor stepped forward respectfully. "Miss Montgomery, we've begun the preservation process. The negatives are in remarkably good condition considering their age and storage conditions. And we've already digitized key sequences," Sophie added, gesturing to the equipment they'd brought, "including your confrontation scene with the vigilante. Committee, it's extraordinary work." Kit's gaze never left Eastwood's face. "Why now, Clint? After all this time?" "Richard's son found his father's instructions after his mother passed," Eastwood explained. "The map, the documentation, everything needed to locate the films." "And you went looking yourself? At your age?" A hint of the old spark flashed in her eyes. "Always the stubborn one." Goldstein stepped forward. "Miss Montgomery, I'm Marcus Goldstein. My uncle was—" "Benjamin Goldstein," Kit finished, eyes narrowing slightly. "United Artists executive who personally called to tell me I'd never work. In pictures again, unless I clarified my associations." She studied him with piercing intensity. "You have his eyes, but hopefully not his conscience." To his credit, Goldstein didn't flinch from her assessment. "I came to prevent the discovery of these films. Mr. Eastwood convinced me to watch them instead. I've spent 3 days confronting a family legacy I've defended my entire career." He met her gaze directly. "I was wrong. My uncle was wrong. And I'm here to help set the record straight." Kit held his gaze for a long moment before nodding slightly. Not forgiveness, precisely, but acknowledgment of his honesty. She turned back to Eastwood. "You've watched it, then? All of it?" "Every frame," he confirmed. "Richard's vision was intact, Kit. The allegorical elements, the commentary on blind patriotism and mob mentality, it's all there. More relevant now than ever." "And my performance?" she asked, a hint of the actress's eternal insecurity surfacing briefly. "The finest work you ever did," Eastwood said simply. "Would you like to see for yourself?" For a moment, Kit seemed overwhelmed by the prospect. 60 years of wondering what might have been, what her career could have become had Sundown Trail been completed and released. 60 years of teaching other actors while her own talents gathered dust. "Yes," she finally said, straightening in her chair. "Yes, I would." Sophie and Eleanor quickly but efficiently set up the portable viewing equipment. As they worked, Kit's attention returned to Eastwood, who had been uncharacteristically quiet. "You didn't just come here to show me old footage, Clint," she said, softly, her voice pitched for his ears alone. "What else did you find at Marston Ranch?" Without speaking, Eastwood reached into his pocket and withdrew the small silver ring. He held it in his palm, offering it to her. Kit's composure faltered as she recognized the ring. With slightly trembling fingers, she took it, holding it up to the light where the engraved initials became visible. "I left this with the letter," she whispered, "in case the films were ever found." "They were," Eastwood said simply. "And the letter? Read it." Kit studied his face, the lines etched by decades of squinting into camera lights, the weathered skin that had made him an icon of rugged individualism. Behind the famous stoicism, she saw the question he couldn't bring himself to ask. "I made the wrong choice," she said finally, clutching the ring. "Protecting your career by distancing myself, telling myself it was for your own good." A brittle laugh escaped her. "Self-sacrifice is so much easier to live with than admitting you were afraid." "We were all afraid then," Eastwood replied, his gravelly voice gentle. "Fear made people do terrible things, or nothing at all," Kit countered. "Which was worse, Clint? The studio executives who actively destroyed careers, or people like you and me who stood by and watched it happen?" The question hung between them, weighted with 6 decades of unresolved guilt and might-have-beens. Before Eastwood could respond, Sophie announced that the equipment was ready. "We've prepared a 20-minute compilation," Eleanor explained, dimming the lights. "Key scenes featuring Ms. Montgomery's performance, along with portions that most clearly demonstrate the film's political commentary." Kit straightened in her chair, instinctively preparing herself like the professional she had always been. "Show me," she said simply. The screen flickered to life, momentarily disorienting in its transportation of the viewers 60 years into the past. And there was Catherine Montgomery in her prime, 37 years old, dark hair framing a face of classical beauty and intelligence. She played Sarah Harmon, a schoolteacher in a frontier town divided by prejudice and fear. The scene showed Sarah confronting the town committee that had gathered to vote on expelling a shopkeeper who traded fairly with the nearby Native American tribe and employed a former Union soldier with suspected abolitionist sympathies. "You speak of protection, of safety." Sarah's character addressed the committee, her voice resonant with controlled fury. "But what you really seek is conformity. You don't want to be safe from danger. You want to be safe from ideas that challenge your narrow vision of America." The town leader, played by a character actor who later enjoyed a successful television career, responded with patronizing authority. "Miss Harmon, there are influences in this town that threaten our way of life. As decent citizens, we have a duty to identify and remove those influences." "And who decides what influences are dangerous?" Sarah countered. "Who sits in judgment? Today, it's Jacob Weber because he trades with Indians. Tomorrow, it's Thomas Burke because he fought for the Union. The day after, perhaps it's me because I teach my students to question rather than obey." She looked around the room with defiant dignity. "A community that purges difference doesn't become stronger. It becomes smaller, meaner, more afraid." As the scene continued, the camera occasionally caught glimpses of a young Clint Eastwood in the background, a deputy sheriff clearly conflicted by the proceedings. The parallel to HUAC hearings was unmistakable yet artfully integrated into the Western setting. In the dimmed light of her retirement suite, Kit Montgomery watched her younger self with an expression of complex emotion. Pride in the work, grief for what was lost, vindication that the performance had survived. Occasionally her lips moved silently, reciting lines remembered across decades. When the compilation concluded 20 minutes later, the room remained silent. Eleanor discreetly restored the lighting to find Kit wiping away tears with dignified restraint. "It was good," she said finally. "Better than I remembered. Richard knew what he was doing." She looked at Eastwood. "What happens to it now?" "That's partly why we're here," Eleanor stepped in. "With your permission, Ms. Montgomery, the Academy Film Archive would like to fully restore Sundown Trail and present it as part of a special exhibition on suppressed cinema. With full credit restoration," Sophie added. "All the names that were crossed out, including yours and Mr. Wilson's, properly acknowledged." Kit considered this, absently turning the silver ring between her fingers. "Richard deserves that. All the blacklisted artists do." She looked at Goldstein. "Your uncle's name will be part of the historical record too, young man. The enforcers alongside their victims." Goldstein nodded solemnly. "Historical integrity requires complete truth, Ms. Montgomery, my family's role included." "And there's something else," Eastwood said, drawing Kit's attention back to him. "I'd like to complete the film." The room fell silent at this unexpected declaration. "Complete it?" Kit echoed. "After 60 years?" "The principal photography was finished," Eastwood explained. "Richard had assembled a rough cut. With modern technology, we can complete post-production according to his notes. Sound, mixing, score, final edit. A film begun in 1962, completed in 2024. Eleanor marveled at the historical significance. A literal bridge across the blacklist era. "Why would you do this, Clint?" Kit asked, studying him intently. "Your career needs no enhancement. Your legacy is secure." Eastwood met her gaze directly. "Not my legacy, Kit. Theirs, Wilson's, yours, everyone who stood on principle and paid the price." He paused, something vulnerable crossing his usually stoic features. "And maybe to answer your question about what's worse, those who actively destroyed careers or those who stood by." "You were 27 years old," Kit reminded him, "a contract player with no power." "I'm not 27 anymore," Eastwood countered, "and I've had power in this industry for decades. Power I could have used sooner to tell this story." Kit considered this, the weight of 60 years hanging between them. "If we do this, if we resurrect Sundown Trail, it won't just be a historical curiosity, not in today's political climate." A spark of the old fire lit her eyes. "There will be people who won't appreciate the parallel between McCarthy's America and certain elements of contemporary discourse." "Good," Eastwood said simply, the familiar determination hardening his features. "Art should disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed. Richard believed that. So did you." A smile slowly transformed Kit's face, not the polite expression of an elderly woman humoring visitors, but the fierce grin of the fighter she had always been. "So I did," she agreed. "So I did." The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. The retirement community's director entered, her professional smile barely concealing her concern about the extended visit. "Ms. Montgomery's afternoon medication schedule," she began diplomatically, "is not your immediate concern, Beverly." Kit cut her off crisply. "We're discussing the resurrection of my film career. Medication can wait." "Nevertheless," Eastwood said, rising with the fluid motion that belied his own advanced years, "we should continue this conversation another time. We've given you a lot to consider, Kit." "Indeed you have," she agreed. As the others began gathering equipment, she gestured for Eastwood to lean closer. When he did, she pressed the silver ring into his palm. "Keep this," she said quietly. "A reminder that some things do get a second chance, even after 60 years." As the group prepared to depart, Kit's voice, suddenly stronger, stopped them at the door. "Mr. Goldstein." Marcus turned back. "Yes, Miss Montgomery. If you truly wish to make amends for your family's role in the blacklist, I have a specific request." Her blue eyes were sharp, penetrating. "Find the others." The last traces of the fog still lingered in the hills surrounding Carmel by the sea when Marcus Goldstein returned to the cabin. Kit Montgomery's request weighed heavily on his shoulders. Find the others. She hadn't meant it in a general sense. She meant the ones who'd vanished from credits, from memory, from history, the blacklisted. He moved carefully through the main room, now emptied of authorities and film historians. Megan, Eleanor, and Sophie were in town cataloging the recovered reels. Sheriff Tanner had returned to the station to file a preliminary closure report, though he confessed to Marcus that none of it sat quite right. Marcus turned toward the stone fireplace. The strange arrangement of objects in Clint's room had been interpreted as a kind of memory map, but Marcus suspected there was more. Clint Eastwood didn't just leave trails. He left symbols, clues embedded in mise-en-scène. He ran his hand along the mantel, a vintage Winchester rifle, a worn photograph of the rawhide cast, and an antique pocket watch. It was the watch that did it. Marcus tilted it. Click. A quiet mechanical shift. A panel in the brickwork slid open. Inside was a narrow compartment, just large enough for a binder. A red leather ledger. No dust. Recently used. He pulled it out, sat down, and opened it. Unlike the previous list, which Eleanor had deduced documented actors blacklisted and lost to history, this ledger had different names. There were familiar ones, directors, producers, studio heads. But these weren't the victims. These were perpetrators. Next to each name was a date, a code, and a brief typed note. Some said, informed on set, or provided testimony. Others were more cryptic. Monroe, dressing room, 1952. But there was one entry that stopped Marcus cold. Alden G. Richards' mentor, director, 54 feud 60. Testified secretly, 1955, Alden Richards had been Clint Eastwood's early patron, a brilliant post-war director known for ambitious, morally complex westerns. It was long assumed Richards had been forced out of Hollywood by the blacklist. But here, according to the ledger, he hadn't been a casualty. He'd been a participant. And Clint had known. That redefined everything. So Clint was hunting not just the victims, Eleanor said, days later, eyes locked on the ledger. He was trying to expose the ones who did the blacklisting. Megan looked pale. He loved Richards. He talked about him like a father. Maybe that's why, Kit said. It's always the ones who betray you that you carry longest. They were gathered in a quiet back room of the Carmel library where Eleanor had secured space to examine the additional reels discovered. Some were unlabeled. Others had titles that never made it to any archive. Sophie had brought high-resolution scanning gear. Marcus leaned against a table, weary. Richards disappeared in 61, Kit continued. Went to France. Never made another film. Always blamed HUAC. But if Clint found out he testified, he'd see it as betrayal not just of art, but of trust, Marcus murmured. Megan pulled out a yellowing envelope from the bottom of the box containing the ledger. Inside was a typed page, a manifesto. I began this thinking I would honor the blacklisted, but that's only half the story. The truth is incomplete without the shadow. If we remember the victims, we must also name the architects. Justice is remembering both. CE. The news changed their mission. Clint hadn't just been building a tribute to forgotten artists, he'd been constructing a reckoning. Sophie tracked the origins of the ledger's codes. These were all declassified in a 1980s FOIA request. Clint must have had someone inside. The codes match internal FBI tags on confidential informants. This one, she pointed, cross-references with a sealed testimony housed in the Reagan Library. Sheriff Tanner arranged quiet access. They reviewed a microfiche copy of a 1955 testimony. It named several actors, including 2 who later died by suicide. The voice in the testimony was anonymized, but the phraseology matched lines from Richard's films. He testified. "No doubt," Eleanor said, visibly shaken. Marcus looked out the window toward the ocean. "And Clint knew this before he disappeared." Kit added, "So the question is, where did he go next? And who else was on that list?" Another name stood out: Stuart Kane, an old studio fixer. Allegedly helped alter film records, doctor archives, and erase credits. Marcus recalled a meeting with Kane decades ago. Smug, sharp, never convicted. "If Kane's still alive," Kit said, "he might be." The last thread. Kane was in New York, retired, 89, living under a pseudonym in a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. After a few calls from industry contacts who still respected Marcus, Kane agreed to a meeting. The group flew east. Kane met them in a library-like parlor, frail but lucid. "So you found the ledger," he said, eyes twinkling. "Took Clint long enough." "You knew?" Megan asked. Kane chuckled. "He came to see me last year. Wanted to know what I'd done. I told him. I named names. I saved some, betrayed others. Regrets are for the young." "Why did you help bury the film?" Marcus asked. "Because it named them," Kane said. "That 1960 Western, The Hollow Hills, was a goddamn confession. Everyone in it knew what it meant. And Richards, he directed it as a way to balance the scales. Or so we thought. Then he flipped, testified. The studio buried the film, cut the reels, discredited the actors. We all played our part." "Did Clint know about the Hollow Hills?" Eleanor asked. Kane nodded. "He had a print, or a partial one. Been restoring it for years. That's what this was all about." Back in Carmel, they re-examined the recovered reels. Among them, one with a torn label, Hollow H. It matched Kane's description. But it was incomplete. Sophie scanned it frame by frame. One actor had been blurred, digitally removed, decades before CGI existed. "This is pre-digital," Sophie murmured. "This was analog, done chemically. Who did this?" Kit stared at a frame. "That was Calvin Reed, my friend. He vanished, went to Mexico. They said he was a communist, but all he ever wanted was to act." "We need to find the rest of the film," Megan said, "before it's too late." Victor Ramirez, Eastwood's groundskeeper, joined them quietly. Clint talked about a vault. Said if anything ever happened to him, the final reel was with the only man who understood why the truth matters. "Who?" Megan asked. Victor looked at Marcus. "You." Marcus sat stunned. "He gave it to me." Victor nodded. 10 years ago. Asked you to store a box in your wine cellar. Said not to open it until the time came." Marcus stood. "It's in Napa. We leave tonight." At the estate, Marcus unearthed the box. Inside, the final reel of the Hollow Hills. Alongside it, a sealed letter. "Marcus, you once asked me why I never told the whole story. The truth is, I was there, in the background. I watched Richard sign. I knew what he did. I did nothing. I was young, scared. That shame followed me. This film is my apology, my act of witness. If I disappear, know it." Marcus sat stunned. "He gave it to me." Victor nodded. 10 years ago. Asked you to store a box in your wine cellar. Said not to open it until the time came." Marcus stood. "It's in Napa. We leave tonight. It's not to vanish. It's to finish what should have been done years ago. Show them the film. Let the ghosts speak." Clint Back in Carmel, they spooled the reel. It was complete, and in one final shot, Eastwood, barely 29, stood wordlessly in the background, watching. The metaphor made flesh. Kit whispered, "He's been carrying this all his life." Megan wiped a tear. "Now we carry it too." Fade to black. The private screening room in Carmel by the Sea had never hosted a film like this. The room, tucked beneath the historic Mission Inn, was dimly lit, smelling faintly of old cedar and celluloid. It seated 20 at most, and that night it held only 8. Megan, Eleanor, Marcus, Sophie, Kit, Sheriff Tanner, Victor, and James Whitmore had assembled, each carrying their own burden, their own fragment of what had become a sprawling and painful truth. The restored film, The Hollow Hills, flickered to life. They watched in silence. A black-and-white western that bore the unmistakable signature of Alden Richards. But this wasn't just allegory. It was coded confession. The story followed a group of cowboys betrayed by one of their own, the authorities. Their names erased, their lives dismantled. A parable of the blacklist, thinly veiled, boldly executed. When the film ended, no one spoke. "We have to show this to the world," Sophie whispered. "They'll sue," Marcus said. "The estates of those named, the studios, the government, if we get bold enough." "But it's truth," Eleanor said. "And truth, no matter how late, deserves to be heard." Kit stared at the credits, some of which they had restored, others still lost to time. Clint knew, all these years, he could have burned it, but he didn't. He chose us. Megan closed her notebook. "Then we don't let him down." The group divided their efforts. Sophie began a quiet digital restoration of the film, piece by piece, using original notes Eastwood had left behind. She encrypted the footage on a secure server with multiple off-site backups. James Whitmore started reaching out to collectors and archivists, trying to locate remaining fragments or props from the film. Every artifact was another node in the web Eastwood had constructed. Kit reached out to families of the blacklisted actors. Some were receptive, others hostile. The wounds hadn't healed, but slowly stories emerged. Letters, diaries. One daughter of a vanished screenwriter provided a recording. Her father had recited the names of his informants before he died. Alden Richards was among them. Meanwhile, Sheriff Tanner handled the quiet inquiries from the press. Rumors had already begun about Eastwood's final project. Tanner fed only vague details, buying them time. Victor retraced Clint's hiking trail with Megan. There, in the cliffs above the sea, they found a final cache, an ammo box buried beneath an ancient oak. Inside were 3 film canisters, a photograph of Clint and Richards in 1959, and a letter addressed to the press to be opened upon the film's release. The pressure began to mount. Marcus received a cease-and-desist letter from a major studio's legal team. They had somehow caught wind of the screenings. "You are in unlawful possession of studio-owned property," it read. He tore it in half. "Let them come," he muttered. "We'll answer with the truth." Eleanor located a contact at the Telluride Film Festival. An anonymous submission might bypass legal scrutiny long enough to make an impact. The festival team was intrigued. The name Eastwood still carried power. They created a plan, a limited screening at Telluride under the title The Hollow Hills, a film by the forgotten. Sophie encoded metadata in the digital file that, when unpacked, would link viewers to a hidden archive of blacklisted artists' biographies, images, and testimonies. The ledger's information, the confession. The night before the file was to be submitted, Megan found Marcus sitting alone. "You okay?" He looked up, eyes hollow. "I testified once. Long ago. I didn't name names. But I didn't defend them either. I sat silent. And silence has weight." She sat beside him. "Then help us break it." He handed her a photograph. It showed a young Marcus with Eastwood and Richards standing on the backlot of a Western set. Forgave me, even when I couldn't forgive myself. The final cut was ready. They screened it one last time in the Carmel Theater, this time to a small invited audience of critics, historians, and family members of the blacklisted. Many wept. Some walked out. A few clapped, slowly, reverently. Kit leaned over to Megan. "It won't be easy after this." Megan nodded. "Nothing that matters ever is." They hit submit on the festival application. The world would know soon. Fade. To black, Telluride, Colorado. The thin mountain air was electric with anticipation. Rumors had been swirling for weeks, and though the festival's schedule still listed the mysterious screening at 10:45 p.m. under the vague title The Hollow Hills, a film by the forgotten, insiders and cinephiles buzzed with speculation. Whispers of Clint Eastwood's final project had circulated for months, growing louder after his disappearance. Now it was here, hidden in plain sight. The theater was packed. Festival programmers, critics, historians, and even a few studio heads had slipped in under pseudonyms. The room stilled as the lights dimmed. A brief preface flickered on the screen. "In honor of the silenced, for those whose stories were stolen, this is not fiction." Then it began. For 91 minutes, The Hollow Hills unfolded like an exorcism. Shot in grainy monochrome, but meticulously restored, it told a tale of betrayal on the American frontier, allegorizing the blacklist era with harrowing precision. The characters, stand-ins for the real artists whose careers were destroyed, battled moral compromise, economic ruin, and fear. A protagonist modeled on Eastwood himself emerged as a young cowboy torn between loyalty and cowardice. The final scene silenced the room. A noose hung empty beneath the gallows. A camera panned away from the town and toward a distant rider. And then, a single title card. Filmed in 1962. Suppressed in 1963. Released 2025. The credits began. Half the audience sat unmoving, absorbing what they'd witnessed. The other half stood in stunned silence. One woman, a historian from UCLA, wept openly. When the house lights came up, applause broke out. Not raucous, but reverent, like a memorial, and that was when all hell broke loose. Within 24 hours, The Hollow Hills became an international sensation. Clips spread across social media, then full bootlegs. The metadata Sophie had embedded activated on several streaming copies, linking viewers to a private archive, scanned pages of the blacklist ledger, scanned testimonies, hand-annotated scripts, even a confession by Alden Richards recorded in 1978 but buried until now. CNN ran a primetime special. Variety printed a cover story titled Clint Eastwood's Ghostwriters, the film he died trying to release. The Washington Post ran a full op-ed by Dr. Eleanor Washington titled The Truth Buried Beneath Celluloid. But the backlash was just as fierce. Paramount and MGM issued cease and desist orders. The Department of Justice released a statement denying the accuracy of several government documents featured in the archive. The estate of Alden Richards filed a lawsuit for defamation and intellectual theft. Megan Reeves received threatening phone calls. Sophie Chen's academic funding was pulled. Marcus Goldstein was called before a studio arbitration board. But it didn't matter. The world had seen it. 3 days after the film's Telluride premiere, Clint Eastwood reappeared. He walked unassisted into the Carmel by the Sea mission courtyard. Dressed in a worn coat and boots, his silver hair long and wind-tossed, he looked like he'd stepped out of one of his own films. The press mobbed him, but he said nothing, not until the next evening. The town arranged a community gathering in the same private theater where the film was first screened. Clint stood before the small crowd, supported by Megan and Victor. Cameras rolled, but he spoke not to them, but to the ghosts he had spent a lifetime carrying. I've made a lot of movies, some good, some bad. But this one wasn't mine. Not really. It belonged to the men and women who weren't allowed to tell their stories. I just carried the reel." He paused, looked out at the crowd. "We buried too many truths in Hollywood. It's time they had a proper funeral." He stepped down. That would be his last public appearance. In the weeks that followed, the recovered archive grew. Kit Montgomery curated a podcast titled Echoes from the Ledger, featuring interviews with children of the blacklisted, critics, and preservationists. It topped charts in 3 countries. Eleanor returned to the Academy to head a new initiative, the Forgotten Films Project. Its mission was to seek out unfinished, buried, or censored films and restore them. Marcus Goldstein issued a formal apology during a televised interview, naming himself as complicit in the silencing of artists. His apology was met with mixed responses. But among those who mattered, the descendants of the blacklisted, it carried weight. The Hollow Hills was disqualified from the Oscars due to technicalities, but the Academy hosted a special symposium in its honor. Clint Eastwood declined to attend, but his letter was read aloud. "Art isn't what you say. It's what you don't let be taken from you." In March of 2025, the Library of Congress added the Hollow Hills to the National Film Registry. The same week, Clint Eastwood passed away peacefully, in his sleep. Megan found him in his chair, the original film reel across his lap, a faint smile on his face. The death of Clint Eastwood sent shockwaves not just through Hollywood, but across every corner of the cultural landscape that had felt the tremor of the Hollow Hills. In an age overrun by fleeting attention, this film, dusty, unfinished, raw, had managed to carve a gash across time. It refused to fade. It refused to be forgotten. His funeral was a quiet affair. No red carpets, no press gauntlet, just a hillside plot overlooking the Pacific beneath a gnarled Monterey cypress. Megan, Kit, Sophie, Marcus, Victor, Eleanor, Sheriff Tanner, all of them stood together. Megan read from the letter Clint had left in the ammo box by the cliffside. "If you're reading this, I probably went out the way I wanted, alone, near the sea, but I don't want the silence to follow me. Finish what I started." Finish what? We started. They buried him with the original script of The Hollow Hills, its edges brittle, its margins littered with annotations, and beside it a fragment of 35mm film, frame marked Scene 47A. The writer turns back. In the months that followed, the movement transformed. Eleanor's initiative snowballed into a foundation backed by the Smithsonian, the British Film Institute, and the Sundance Institute. They called it the Writer's Requiem, a global archive of suppressed or forgotten art. It became a sanctuary not only for blacklisted works, but for films censored under repressive regimes, for scripts confiscated by authoritarian states, for stories buried by violence or shame. Sophie was named Director of Digital Restoration. She built a secure infrastructure capable of scanning and uploading fragile media from anywhere in the world, anonymously. Victims of censorship began submitting. Reels, flash drives, letters. One arrived from Ukraine, another from Iran, a third from an 83-year-old man in Alabama who had hidden his father's war documentary in a barn since 1955. Kit began teaching a course at NYU titled Ghost Cinema, Suppressed Films and the Memory of Media. Her class filled within hours every semester. Her students called her the Real Whisperer. Megan published a book, Hollow Hills and Hollywood. It became a New York Times bestseller. In it, she told not only Clint's story, but the stories of those the blacklist had destroyed. She ended it with the words, "The film was never the finish line. It was the map. Now we follow it." And then came the final twist. It arrived on a rainy morning in late October, a package delivered to Sophie's doorstep in Oakland. No return address. Just a small box with a label. Burn me unread, or don't. Inside was a second ledger, older than the one they had exposed. Different handwriting. It was dated 1948, but this wasn't a blacklist. It was a whitelist, a record of who had cooperated, who had traded names, who had prospered while others were exiled. Names no one expected: a revered studio head, a Pulitzer-winning screenwriter, two beloved actors whose stars had never dimmed. Sophie called an emergency meeting. They gathered in Eleanor's apartment in L.A., the ledger laid out like scripture. The room went silent. "This will ruin people," Marcus said, his fingers trembling above a name he had once called a friend. "It will unruin others," Kit replied, and so they scanned it, encrypted it, and began cross-referencing the signatures, the payments, the deals. They found receipts, they found payoffs, they found betrayals written in ink and blood. News of the second ledger dropped like a seismic charge. The New York Times ran it on the front page. The whitelist. New ledger reveals betrayers behind the blacklist era. Obituaries were rewritten, statues were taken down. The Academy issued a formal apology on live television for its role in failing to defend truth against fear. But the greatest impact came not in the headlines, but in the silences. In living rooms where grandchildren looked differently at the black and white portraits on the walls. In classrooms where film history textbooks were quietly replaced with revised editions. In backlots and boardrooms where the phrase "creative differences" no longer concealed censorship. And in the hearts of artists who finally had names for the ghosts they'd carried. 1 year later, Telluride hosted a commemorative screening of The Hollow Hills on the anniversary of its debut. They chose an outdoor venue this time, a natural amphitheater beneath the stars. Before the film began, Megan stepped forward. "This is for the ones we lost. Not just their lives, but their futures, their words, their films. Clint gave us the first spark. The rest was up to us." She signaled the projector operator. The film began, but this time, after the final scene, a new sequence rolled, never before seen. Sophie had added it, a montage, faces, names, archival photos, audio clips, whispers from the past layered into a tapestry of testimony, then a simple message: let the ghosts speak, and then let them rest. The crowd stood. No applause. Just silence. And then, softly, someone began to hum the score from The Hollow Hills. A second voice joined. Then a third, a chorus of the living singing for the dead. Because the truth doesn't end. It echoes. It haunts. And finally, if we're lucky, it heals. The sea crashed against the Monterey cliffs below as the wind wound through the cypress trees. It was a Tuesday in May. The sky, a flat silver, hung low over the horizon as though pressing history back into the land. Megan stood alone at the edge of the bluff where Clint Eastwood had vanished that fateful week, her eyes on the same waves he had once watched. But now they seemed different, as if they too had witnessed something and could not forget. In her coat pocket she carried a new film reel, not Eastwood's, not The Hollow Hills, but hers. It was called Echoes of Truth. She'd written it quietly over the last 8 months, in the margins of grief, in the spaces between protests, lawsuits, and symposiums. It wasn't a direct sequel, nor was it a documentary. It was a reckoning, a meditation on silence and the cost of complicity. She hadn't told anyone yet. Not Sophie, not Victor, not even Kit. She'd simply gone to work every day, reviewing archives, restoring damaged reels, researching letters long thought lost, and somewhere in that daily resurrection of other people's voices, hers had returned. She walked back from the cliff's edge toward the parked car. The wind pressed against her back, nudging her forward. The Venice Film Festival had never seen anything quite like it. Echoes of Truth had premiered to a standing ovation before the final credits even rolled. Critics stumbled over themselves trying to describe it. Meta-cinematic memory loop, wrote one. Part elegy, part confession. Wholly unshakable, wrote another. Megan never took the stage. She watched from the back row. Sophie had insisted on attending, and even Marcus flew in, despite the risk to his reputation. Eleanor sent a video message from Jerusalem, where she was helping launch a Writer's Requiem satellite archive. Kit cried through the entire final act. The film told the story of a nameless archivist who uncovers a mysterious reel labeled Only, silenced. As the archivist restores the film, they begin to hallucinate, seeing figures from the past, hearing voices no one else can hear. The reel becomes a portal into memory, guilt, and redemption. In the end, the archivist disappears. Not. Vanished. Absorbed, Megan had written it in fragments. A script made of secrets. Each scene inspired by true stories from the Blacklist era. Every frame dedicated to someone whose art never had a chance. The night after the premiere, she found herself alone on a Venetian balcony, staring at the Grand Canal. Kit joined her, 2 glasses of wine in hand. "You know," Kit said, handing her one, "you didn't just make a film. You built a mirror." Megan nodded. "It's what Clint did. Only this time, I didn't need a ghost to tell me where to point the lens." Writer's Requiem grew beyond anyone's expectations. With backing from multiple governments, universities, and even private donors like Scorsese and Spielberg, it became the largest global initiative for suppressed and censored art in history. By its second year, it had uncovered a collection of anti-colonial films smuggled out of Angola in the 1970s. A banned feminist sci-fi series produced in Argentina under a pseudonym, a North Korean defector's animated film satirizing dictatorship, stored inside a music box. A trove of handwritten scripts by Jewish filmmakers arrested in 1930s Berlin, each one tagged with a yellow star in the margins. Sophie, now chief curator, implemented what she called the Spectral Index, an AI-powered search engine that allowed users to trace the connections between blacklisted works and modern cinema. It became a tool for historians, filmmakers, and students alike. For every known name like Trumbo or Lardner, there were dozens more, silent casualties of paranoia, prejudice, and profit. Now they had a place. Now they had names. Victor had inherited Clint's house at Carmel by the sea. He didn't change much. Left. The furniture, the books, even the smell of old cigars and coastal air. But he converted the garage into a small theater. Once a month he hosted secret screenings, only a dozen or so invited at a time. No phones, no press. Just people who cared. One night, Megan showed Echoes of Truth there for the first time. The audience included a young indigenous director from Canada, a Turkish journalist who'd fled government persecution, and an elderly man who had once held the boom mic for The Hollow Hills. When the final scene played, the archivist stepping into the light. No one moved for a long time. Victor poured scotch and said, "Feels like Clint's still here. Or maybe, finally resting." A year after Venice, Megan received a letter in the mail, handwritten, postmarked from Oklahoma. Inside was a photocopy of a studio memo dated 1961. Terminate the Eastwood project immediately. Too risky, too sympathetic. This is not the story we want told. No signature. Just a P.S. They tried to erase it. You made it unforgettable. Thank you. Megan stared at the letter until the ink blurred. Then she added it to the archive. Clint Eastwood was buried with no epitaph. Just his name and 2 dates. But on the 3rd, anniversary of his death, Sophie arranged for a discreet memorial bench at the Carmel Cliffs. Engraved on it was the phrase he once whispered before his final screening. We buried too many truths in Hollywood. It's time they had a proper funeral. Tourists didn't know the story. They sat, took selfies, and left. But the few who did know, students, filmmakers, archivists, they'd pause, sit a while. Sometimes they'd leave behind a reel, a note, or a USB drive tucked beneath the bench. Some were full of ghosts, others full of truth, often both. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.